Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Freedom Forum, and I'd like to welcome our guest from Canada. Welcome, Wallace Klinck.
Hi there, Marty. I think we recovered for a day or two at least from our grapefruit-sized hailstones.
Yes, I heard that before, and I'm thinking just you could reshape an entire car in just a few seconds
It
with
doesn't take very long.
grapefruit size. That's right, exactly right. Could be
I've
quite
never seen that myself
yeah,
before.
yeah,
That's extreme.
huge. And Robert Klinck from the other side of Canada. Welcome, Robert.
Good to be with you again, Arnie.
How is any hailstorms your area, Robert?
No, just excessive humidity and heat, but nothing that exceeds what you're accustomed to, I don't think.
We do get extremes. That's true. That's true. Although the humidity, you've got to head to the north of Australia to get it, but it's certainly there. The tropics is, yeah. And I find it interesting because to me, Canada is so further north than I consider I'd like to live in regard to the poles, and and so it would be obviously the winters would be quite challenging, but you survive. You blokes survive. Your nation survives. It gets through. So we can actually accommodate. Humans can accommodate the different weather extremes, and I think that that's most important.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
a mystery that the Inuit never followed the heat south. They just stayed for the winter,
Yeah.
60 below, and they're building igloos.
Yeah.
Very
That's
strange,
absolutely
strange.
incredible. Isn't it incredible that they just
Yeah,
adapted?
they could have just walked out of the area and gone to a more moderate climate.
That's
They
right.
didn't.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was where they lived, and that was where they loved living. So it's
Hmm.
to me it's fascinating because the different cultures, if you like, um, do like where they live, and I know that they accommodate it. And I do note, and it's not a derogatory thing. It's people who live closer to the equator do have darker skin, and that's part of
Oh,
how they actually physically accommodate the increment in the sun exposure, the heat, and the rays. They're more intense. So that to me is well, there's the natural world. People are adapting and accommodating. Now, the title for today, I've titled it Abolition of All Rights of Inheritance. And this is actually an extract. I'm just going to cut across to the website. This is Marxist.org, Marxist.org, and here are the 10 steps to communise a country. This is an extract from the Communist Manifesto. Abolition of All Rights and Inheritance. Now, I know that's the title, but in actual fact, what we did want to continue to talk about was the Communist Manifesto and the 10 steps. But that particular step 3, abolition of all rights of inheritance, to me covers so much. I've recently read a book titled The Killing of History by Keith Windschuttle, The Killing of History. And in the lessons of history, it is that you actually build up. You build up lessons, you build up your inheritance, you build up your culture from history. And yet, when history becomes deconstructed, as it is, it's sort of like fact is clouded by fiction. Fiction becomes fact for political objectives. It's no longer real, and so you can't trust the lessons of history. And I find it fascinating because it's to me it's a completely turning upside down of a way of thinking, and it undoes, if you like, a scientific approach to any subject. So okay, I'll open the floor because no doubt I've caused some thoughts. So Robert, your thoughts on the abolition of all rights of inheritance?
The Communist Manifesto was published in 1848, and 1848 was the year of general revolution through Europe. Apparently it started in Sicily, but there were revolutions in Italy and France and Germany, not in England, although there was a lot of agitation in England.
Mm-hmm.
And so Marx was, and his supporters were very active in this process of revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And they published this document which actually laid out a system. It was not something that you would think they could just have thought of out of the blue. I think it must have had quite a past. And the various principles in it hold together. They all reinforce each other.
Mm-hmm.
And if you analyze them, you could say, I think, that every one is a subversion of the principle of inheritance.
Mm.
There's heavy taxation, and there's depossession of land, and there's establishment of a central bank for the purpose of centralizing financial power.
Mm-hmm.
There is public education, which, well, we've seen the results of that now. It's become just a propaganda agency, and even having women in common. It was a very strange thing to mention, but we've almost got to that with the sexual revolution and all that. And the effect of it is to take away the inheritance we have of family life and the benefits that derive from that.
Yeah,
So,
I see all of those disinheritance, if you like. I mean, the accumulation of property. That's something that, say, your parents, grandparents, great-great-grandparents, multiple generations may have built up. And the thing is that they've put the effort in to establish, to develop, to improve, and there it is, it's gone. And it's now all things are common, and it's just the state owns everything. And I think it's most profound that centralization is an expression of the dominance hierarchy, whether it's capitalist or communist, the dominance hierarchy. So this to me is a glaring warning. When you listen to what this man Peterson is talking about, Jordan Peterson, dominance hierarchy, life is suffering. And to me, it's a deconstruction of the Christian narrative of having that I have come that ye might have life more abundant, which is completely different from life is suffering. And of course, the dominance hierarchy, when the kingdom of God is within, it's decentralizing. So it's exactly the opposite of what this man Peterson is talking about. Wally.
Well, that's right, Arnie. I think that Marx came from a time when the Industrial Revolution was just getting ready to take off. There was a lot of concentration of wealth, and he saw some terrible conditions. Undoubtedly, they were very bad conditions. But he assumed that the problem was that the industrialist was appropriating a portion of the wealth that was produced by the workers. And so his approach was to appeal to the workers to unite and to begin a revolution to take back their appropriated wealth. But Marx came at a time before the really intensive industrial revolution, and especially the age of automated process. And Marx attributed production to labor. Now, labor, that is a completely unrealistic position. As a matter of fact, today, the way things are just going inexorably is to eliminate labor. But that does not suggest that there is any damage to be incurred by doing that, or that there should be, because actually it should be a way for us to emancipate ourselves. But you cannot, as I've said, you cannot pay robots wages, because robots don't eat. But the cost of robots goes into the final cost of goods that are coming out on the production line. So their wages have to be paid, but the only way to pay them is an inheritance to the individual consumer or citizen. In fact, that enormous productivity is an inheritance. It's an inheritance that is accrued because of the long accumulation of knowledge and of technique and so on from the past, going way back to the days when somebody invented a lever with a stick and a rock. And the thing of it is, those who wish to destroy our past or our inheritance, our cultural heritage, are actually attacking the reservoir of knowledge, productivity, and so on, which has allowed us to build up our productive capacity in our society, and which is continuing to do so, and which should continue to do so.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to ask why people would want to destroy. Some people say, oh, the past is all bad, let's destroy it. But you see, the past is what we build on. We're only human beings. We're only mortals. We can only learn. You can't just all of a sudden project yourself into a perfect dimension. We have to progress over time. That's the way we are. We have to learn.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's through learning that we develop increasingly more effective ways of living, producing, living, and so on. And so you have to ask the question of those who want to overthrow the system as a system. What is their objective? It appears to be that they want power.
Of course.
To impose upon society their particular conception, which they may think is utopian and is utopian, but is not necessarily realistic at all, because they're literally throwing away the experience of the past.
Yeah, no, that is so, you're so right on that, Wally, that it is so destructive. All of those building blocks that have gone on for eons, and to the point where we have just this huge cultural inheritance before us. Now, I might paint a picture here that I think is most profound, and that is that the inheritance that is there is ours for the asking. It is ours. But if we don't have the, if you like, the heart, if we don't have the vision to inherit it, to actually seize what is the abundance in front of us, if we don't have that, then it really is no wonder this civilization is collapsing, because it has no vision for the future. Whereas if we can see the vision of one of plenty, of splendor, of abundance, if we can see that vision and go out after it, to me that is a vision, that is a, if you like, a purpose or a policy that is worth going after. It is. And the thing is that of all people who should see it, it is those who are bind back to the natural world, who actually look at what, in context, how these things are working. Automation, robotics, advanced control. Everything is there in front of us. But this narrative, this, if you like, abstraction of the financial system stops us from seizing the moment. And this abstraction is what we have to demesmerize ourselves from. Debt as policy. Debt as policy is the issue. Robert.
Well, that idea of having a vision is very important. The issue is what enables people to have a consistent vision. And that must derive from some strongly held ideology, or even more strongly from a religion. And as you mentioned, Arnie, the Christian religion is one that envisages abundance for the inhabitants of the earth. So it's a tragedy that Christianity has become so diluted, when it hasn't completely failed, because it could have provided the vision that would have led us to adapt to this new productive environment we're living in, where we have automation and robotics all over the place. You know, it's a sad thing, but some people don't want that vision because they want to have power over other people, which is something, of course, in Christianity that is utterly denied. Christ never imposed his will on anyone. It was always with him a matter of personal choice. Quite remarkable. But the people who want power, in order to attain that power, have to keep the general population from enjoying the abundance that is just trying to come into their possession, you know. But for this reason, they promote a puritanical view of society, which means there is an elite that has to decide for the general population and impose a discipline upon them from which you cannot dissent without grave consequences to your welfare.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, we're living in a world today where the old Marxist cry, workers of the world unite, has become obsolete because work is largely obsolete.
Yeah.
And a great deal of the work we see being done is totally artificial and just invented in order to allow the distribution of salaries and wages. But there's no necessity for what people are being required to do. It's an arbitrary imposition upon them.
But I agree with that, Robert. That's in the building industry, for instance. There was a time when you could discuss with the town clerk what your proposals were, and you'd design it, and it was set to a standard. You'd use the building codes, and virtually in a couple of weeks, you'd have permission to construct your dwelling. And now, this huge laborious tasks of all these committees and all these commissars that have to put their two bob in, all these codes and all these everything that's going in order to build. And of course, it's a long and protracted, expensive and painful exercise to just build a home. And of course, it's got new codes of environmental this and environmental that, and aesthetics, and even the colors that you use in building. And of course, that to me is just absurd. It's all these interferences in order to build a home. And of course, that to me is essentially sabotage. It's economic sabotage because if you need to build a home, well, yeah, as long as you build it to a standard and it's a reasonable dwelling and all that sort of stuff, well, then get on with it. But nothing of the sort. And so it becomes so painfully obvious that the people are actually creating work in order to justify their existence, their payroll. Wallace.
Creating work is the business of the authoritarian.
Mm-hmm.
Because the person who simply wants others to be free is not interested in constricting their lives in every possible way. Now, so these people will tell you, well, we have to because life is complicated and so on and so forth. But you see, there's such a thing as balance. Yes, you do have to have some regulation, but if you over-regulate, you simply sabotage the project. And we've seen that, of course, in Canada recently with pipelines. And so again, it's an authoritarian thing, and it stems from this idea of giving work, because these people create for themselves an empire in which they function and for which they services that they render, they get paid, even if those services get to the point where they're more damaging than helpful. But it's according to this law. It's the Old Testament idea, you know, you're condemned to work by the sweat of your brow for your daily bread. And but that's very different than the Christian vision, where there's going to be the possibility of an abundance that is just beyond containing. And that abundance extends. It's not just a physical or materialistic abundance. It's a physical abundance which frees you into a state of leisure when you can enjoy a spiritual abundance as well, a cultural abundance of, an intellectual, an abundance of the mind, the soul, and the spirit.
Yeah, leisure is an interesting thought in regard to that, Wally. I'm thinking of it that the Puritan would have everyone working no matter what, and yet the Puritan themselves generally ensure their inheritance, their family inheritance. Their inheritance is secure. They're good, but everyone else has to be controlled. And of course, it's absolute humbug. It's essentially, as you say, the bureaucratic mind that they have to impose. You can call it Puritanism, but it really is a bureaucratic mind. And it's a mind that's actually drawn within itself. It's not actually putting things in context. If you consider the words of Christ, only do unto him what you'd have him do unto you. So what they're doing to someone else is nothing like what they would want done to themselves. and it's completely disproportionate. Robert.
And
That is true. I've been reading recently about the intellectual elite of Britain, and it's amazing how the big names in this area knew each other, and they would take young members of families they were related to or very familiar with under their wing and give them fantastic educations. You know, from the time they were 3, 4 years old, they were studying mathematics and multiple languages and everything else. So they created this culture which fed their own egos because they obviously were better educated than anyone else. And it gave them an excuse for becoming the people who decided what was going to be done in society. But they did this while they were also suppressing opportunities for other people to advance at the pace they were capable of, because, you know, public education is largely a retardation of learning. It's, you know, phased, and they hold back the really bright kids, and they get kids in there who should never even be there because their aptitudes lie elsewhere.
Yeah.
So it's an inefficiency in itself. And another aspect of the sort of regulation of society that leads to its virtual paralysis. I mean, we have projects, economic projects around here that are perpetual. But if there is a real need, if there is an absolute need for an overpass to be installed or something, they've demonstrated that they can do it overnight.
Yeah.
But if there is no immediate necessity, they will drag these things out for years. You know, we had a pedestrian bridge go over a highway near the airport here. It took them 3 years to build a pedestrian bridge. Well, I'll tell you that in China, they have just completed, about in the same time, a span with a suspension bridge of over 6,000 feet, over a mile, 8 lanes. They get things done. I'm not advocating dictatorship or anything like that, but you can see the contrast. We just have no idea of what modern economies are capable of, because we have this systematic sabotage going on all the time in order to create employment.
I agree, Robert. I spend a lot of time reading, and I'm fortunate to accumulate or have access to quite an expanded library. Or libraries might be a better word, because it is libraries, multiple libraries. And the thing is, the more I read, the more I learn, and especially of the efforts by others and the thinking of others. And what it's showing to me is that this is actually part of my cultural inheritance, is the thinking, the pre-thinking, the post-thinking, the analysis, the review, and all in a sense. I think it was Windschuttle said it beautifully in his book Killing of History. He said the scientific method, the Baconian scientific method, in other words, observation, place a thesis once you've got an observation and challenge the thesis. And if it needs to be reviewed and accommodated, then so be it. And you continue to develop the thesis or on the basis of observation and testing. Now, an example is this thing about supposed climate change and the effects and all that sort of stuff. The thesis doesn't hold water. It can't. The accommodation of climate, we talk about it virtually every meeting at this forum. The climate is so variable, and yet they're talking about 100th of a degree as being catastrophic. And yet here we are, you know, you've got hailstones in the west, you've got sultry, humid conditions in the east, and I've got the fire going in Australia, and it's just all of these differences and variables. It's madness to consider that you need bureaucracy for that. It's the killing of thought. It's the killing of our culture. It's the killing of our history. Political objectives, more important than truth, or certainly science, and science in the sense of the Baconian method of observing and placing your thesis for testing and for repeatability. Wallace.
well, we seem to have a lot of people today with preconceived notions about what society should be like. Notions which they themselves don't have a very clear, generally a very clear idea. The thing that is, things like this climate hysteria, if you want, they're a distraction. They're a distraction which takes people away from more fundamental thinking. And it's based upon, basically upon the idea of justice and equality, abstractions like that, which things which inherit in nature in their proper form, but which mankind has attempted to supplant, actually, especially the materialist elements. They think that they are going to establish a system of justice and equality and so on, which is going to create the ideal conditions upon earth. Well, in the first place, equality is not the rule of nature. It's not the rule of civilizations. The rule of civilization building is to supersede what you've done before, to move beyond what you've done before. That is not equality. Equality means stasis. And you cannot, I mean, the American Constitution says that all men were born equal. That's not true.
No.
We're not born equal. None of us were born equal. None of us want to be equal. And if we were all equal, we would all be doing the same things at all times, and nothing would progress. It's an idea that's based upon an idea of envy and scarcity. There is not really enough for everybody, so we have to make regulations to ensure that no one gets more than their just share. Well, Douglas said, if you strive too much for justice, you will miss it.
Yeah.
In other words, you'll end up in tyranny, because justice requires legal procedures and legalism. The more it becomes dominant in the lives of the individual and society, the more the society becomes controlled. It leads straight to tyranny.
Yeah. I'm thinking of inheritance exactly in that perspective, Wallace, and that is that our cultural inheritance is one of actually limiting government, of limiting laws, and insisting that laws be not arbitrary. And that is that the commissar just passes a ruling on someone whether the law is written or not. And I know that there's certainly some very good literature in our library on the passing of Parliament, and bureaucratic lawlessness is another one. And that is where the if you like, the minister can just have a determination on the day, and then that becomes the law. And of course, that's absolute madness. It's an imposition of totalitarianism, and it's the very antithesis of what our constitutions are about, and that is defining the limiting terms of government. This is your boundary and no further. That's what the Australian Constitution is written around, limiting government, not allowing lawlessness in a sense. And so the deconstructing of our history, the deconstructing of our constitution, the deconstructing of our culture is very deliberate, malevolent. It's destructive towards us. And that's part of the design, and it hasn't stopped with the Iron Curtain coming down. It's expanded to incorporate the entire world. Robert.
Yes, that idea of limiting the power of government and subjecting that power to a judgment by the population is an essential component of our inheritance, is it not?
Yeah.
And that has been undermined, subverted so drastically. I think of elections now, and the idea of an election seems to be that once you get a new government in power, well, they have carte blanche to do anything they want. And there is virtually no opportunity for the public to have any input into it. There are sometimes commissions that go around and consult the public, but they'll do what they want to do in the end. And I mean, modern day prime ministers look like dictators. They're not really, because they are just the front men for people behind the scenes. But we have traveled so far from the concept of limiting the power of government and subjecting it to scrutiny and control by the population, that it's really frightening.
Yeah. I'm mindful of the time, gentlemen. We're up to the 30-minute mark, and we've hardly wet our little toe on this 10 steps
That's
to
right.
communise the country. Closing comments, please, Wallace.
Well, we certainly are involved in a renewed attempt to destroy our culture with the object of replacing it with something. And I think we should know what they intend to replace it with. That is something that we don't really hear too much about. But it doesn't take too much of a review of history and our attempts to limit the power of the state, make the state a servant of the community and not a master of the community.
Mm-hmm.
And there is balance. Balance is always important in all processes. And when things go off balance, then there tends to be normally a countervailing force which brings it back into balance. And today we seem to be lacking that particular countervailing force. And I think it is largely in the knowledge, the lack of knowledge in the people,
Mm-hmm.
and the lack of, therefore, their lack of determination to give proper attention to these trends and to defend their freedoms with a clear understanding of what it's all about. But some people say, oh, this is not 100 years ago. This is the modern age. Things have changed. Well, you see, that is a very insidious and seditious idea that has been impregnated into the minds of so many people. You do not change the functions of natural law or the principles of natural law with the passage of time. And so if you're going to abandon natural law and replace it with limited and imperfect human conceptions about what is appropriate in the lives of mankind, then you are, I think, headed for some very serious trouble because you're ignoring reality itself.
Yeah, beautifully put. Thank you for that, Wallace. Closing comments, please, Robert.
Well, the people are not sensitive to the idea that was fairly common in previous generations, that there is a constant need for resistance to the will for power. And there are people who are always trying to concentrate power. Once it's concentrated, they believe they can seize it. And it's been done quite successfully. I'm not sure how many people know the term that Marx applied to communist subversion. He called it old mole, suggesting that it was something that had existed for a long time and that was always at work. And today we can see it at work. We can see this mining of all sanity and sensibility and political decentralization. It's just an unending battle to keep society on some kind of an even keel. So I think if people kept that terminology in mind, old mole, and thought, well, at all times in human history, people have been trying to subvert the stabilizing institutions of society in order to seize power, it would be a great defense mechanism that we would have.
Thank you for that, Robert, and also that history lesson. Isn't it so important that we look back in order to go forwards? And if anything, the more I read, the more I want to read. And there's a hunger there to learn the lessons of history so that they can be presented through this forum and also certainly thought through in our minds. I appreciate your scholarship. Thank you, Wallace. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Arnie. Nice to be with you.
No worries.
Thank you.
Cheers,
Thanks
ladies and
again.
gentlemen. Cheers, then. Bye.